Hello and welcome to the Digital Digest, your weekly breakfast of insights, tips and tricks and general information that will help anyone trying to move things forward in this digital world of accounting. This show is sponsored by iPlicit, the go-to mid-market financial system ideal for multi-entity companies and fast-growing businesses. It's also brought to you by both the Digital Disruptors and SB Digital, which are trying to push the boundaries in this digital accounting space. I'm your host, Ryan Piercy, and I'm joined by Russell Frayne from Gravita, previously from Assets, as we dive into how to, deliver effective training in digital transformation. So on that basis, I think we should just crack straight on. So Russell, over to you. Why is training so critical when we're doing any digital transformation or system advisory projects?
Thanks for having me, Ryan, first and foremost. And yeah, I've always been a massive advocate of quality over quantity with this sort of stuff. And I think experience dictates if you don't focus on training, whether it be client or your sort of team delivery training in this area, that you really do set yourself up for a sort of subpar delivery. And I think a lot of us have been in that space in the past. So I have various war wounds in that space. So I've always been adamant of quality over quantity in this area. And I've spent the last 4 or 5 years working out how to deliver that in various different levels of different size practice, really.
Yeah, and I think you're kind of playing down where it could be slightly problematic. It could be disastrous from my experience, right? Like you generally agree a process. You've got this entire implementation. It can go perfectly well. If training is not effective, the client just thinks the whole project's been a disaster from my experience. And it also means that you are then firefighting afterwards with support or extra resource you're throwing at it, just to try and get, the clients back on side. Because once you've lost them, it's really hard to kind of do that. So from that process, where do you tend to bring in training? Because there's different stages you can do it at. Do you do it all in one go? Do you do it kind of at the start before implementation? When do you generally deliver training?
I think it depends where you side on training. So first and foremost, we look at how we would deliver our training internally. So based on upskilling our staff to deliver effective training. So I think that's always where I would start my focus. Because like you said, that if you get this wrong, disastrous doesn't really summarize it, because you're dealing with people's livelihood at the end of the day. Back in the day where we were lifting and shifting data for an MTD solution for sole traders who don't really care about their accounts and financials and things like that. They just want an end of year set of accounts, a tax bill and a VAT return. Whereas if you're looking at actual businesses with employees, stakeholders, you generally are dealing with their livelihood. I don't think people take that responsibility serious enough. So I heavily invest in upfront training and skill delivery for the teams delivering the training, because that's the jump off point. After that, we focus on, or I've always focused really with the clients on staging of training, because there's only so much that you can absorb at any one time, right? We've all sat in webinars, seminars, training sessions where they've gone on for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours, there's nothing worse than seeing a whole day's worth of training in your diary. So trying to break it down in manageable chunks, but also delivering it in a way that the stakeholders in the business can see how it changes their job role going forward. Because the other thing I hate is vanilla training that teaches you how to button press, but it doesn't actually interact with your business. So we spend a lot of time focusing on who in the business is going to benefit from the platform, who uses the system day to day, and how that impacts them. So that's first and foremost. And that's before we jump into what I'd call platform training thereafter.
Yeah. So we call it, tailored training, right? We're breaking it down the system to actually show how the client will be using it, not a generic thing. We actually had an example recently, which it just kind of ended up that way, which we didn't really want to do it. And on reflection, we probably should have put our foot down and go, actually, we should have done this differently. In that our implementation process had been delayed. It can happen, we were relying on tools to do that they'd failed, and we had to kind of redo it from the start. But what that meant is that by the time we got to the scheduled training, the system wasn't ready to use their data. So we then pivoted into demo data, and just the training wasn't effective. The client came out the other side not really understanding what they needed to do. And since then, we've been having to do, I guess, what we said, right? Throw resource at it to help that client. We want to make sure that they get the most out of the system. But it's just been, it's been a problem for them, hard for us, and trying to fit that around all the other work you do just becomes even more of a challenge, right? So, so if you could talk a little bit.
Who picks the bill up for that then, in terms of that?
Us, right? Like,
exactly.
Yeah, it's not like you can charge for that because in effect you've not delivered the effective training that you've promised the client. So, but I really like to understand a bit more. You say you kind of stage it, right? You break it down. How do you determine what you deliver at what stages of that? And give an example of what kind of system.
So I suppose if I look at some more of a more complex type integration, where you're actually looking at a finance function, as opposed to something that is quite basic. Think, everyone's done basic sort of platform training, whether it's, a DEX, an auto entry, a zero stage QuickBooks type implementation. Here's the functionality, and you break it down into bite-sized chunks. That's quite straightforward for the small business owner, quite easy, manageable. And I think everybody's got a game plan there. When you look at something that's more end to end, where you've got different sort of AP functions, you've got sales ledger functions, you've got, it could be inventory, could be reporting, could be whatever, multiple different people doing different things. For me, I've always been a stickler, and it could be the OCD, is that I like to do things in order. So everybody at the sort of the end point can see how they interact with that system as it works its way along the channel. Now, not everybody needs to be involved in everything, and I'm always a big advocate of the right person in the right role. But they need an awareness of how the knock-on effect is for what they do. So when I try and break it down. So at the front end, it's how we get data into the platform. So who in the business is entering the data, whether it be sales invoicing or purchase ledger or the bank reconciliation type work, and how they then interact, and then how that then kicks on further down the chain and who's involved there. So, smaller businesses, it could be the same person for multiple steps. Others, they could have, segmented departments. But as we're breaking it down, we make sure that everyone in the further part of the chain sees the benefit of the new platform. So we're showing where the value is, but also they can see that how, that the front end interacts with the next stage and so on. So then we're looking at the system and process as a whole, as opposed to individual bite-sized chunks. I find a lot of business owners run their business in siloed processes. And sometimes, transformation doesn't have to be, a significant thing. It could just be better aligning some of your processes. The platforms could be fine.
Yeah. And, a critical thing of digital transformation is we are not lifting and shifting. We are educating in how to utilize the tech in a more effective way. And that could be ripping up exactly what they've been doing for the last, 20, 30 years and going, okay, now you need to kind of start from scratch, which can be terrifying for people. The reason I guess I ask is how you break that down is we've been toying with the idea of splitting ours up. But the problem we've always found when doing that is that people want to be able to do work from the start. So literally as it goes live, they want to be able to kind of do all their processing. And if we then, broke our training up over a number of weeks, they would they're not be able to do certain bits as they go along. So we've toyed with splitting it up. We've come back to doing it in a chunk, but recording it and sharing it with the client, and then touching base as we've gone along. And that's why I was really interested to see, well, if you're saying you break it up, are you doing it like a bit per day? Are you doing it like over a number of weeks? Are you staggering it to say do reporting when they'd be looking at management accounts? How do you kind of approach that?
So you need to look at what their business critical processes are. So if they've got certain things that from day one is non-negotiable, they have to be using these platforms, always working, and absolutely that's your first focus. But like, as much as I hate using demo data, you can lift and shift extracts of their existing data into a demo environment. So you can do training ahead of time for certain processes. So things like management reporting, KPIs, forecasting, budgeting, like their outputs. And normally they're reliant on good data coming in. But if you've got any form of data, right, you can still structure that in a sort of sandbox environment. So whilst you train out in chunks, you need to work out which chunks interact well. You can do, multiple trainings in one day. You don't have to. You could have two different teams in being trained the same day if you've got business critical processes. So I think it really just does depend. But yeah, absolutely, you wouldn't want to string this out for weeks. It needs to be a fairly slick end to end. It's called go live for a reason, not go practice. So
Yeah.
You can do as much as you can do ahead of time. And I don't like running systems in parallel if I can avoid it. But I will, depending if it needs the requirement, I will run a sandbox environment ahead of time with some data dumped in there, because when you're dealing with the client data, they can vision what the future state looks like. Like you said earlier, if you're using demo data, it means nothing to anyone, and you're always fudging tasks. So that's how we would approach that end to end, rather than just, like you say, roll it out for a number of weeks, in which case you've got a really disconnected process.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, because we do something similar. We've never actually referred to it as training. So we so take Xero as an example, right? If they're on like a Sage or a QuickBooks, something you can use and move my books to move them. Sometimes we will lift and shift the data across, not actually review it, not do any of the work that's validating the data, but just move it across so that they can have a play with the system, really kind of push it and then come back with specific questions to us. And that's before we then go and do the training. So they've already got that kind of look and feel. They know where they're going to navigate to certain things. It means the training that we actually then deliver is much more effective. And we do that in certain instances. Not a lot of the time, it will be actually when there are specific nuances the client's a little bit wary of, a little bit worried about, and they want to have that chance to play with it. And we've got, in a similar way, we've got demo like expense capture systems that we connect in, and they can feed data through, so they can have a little play. What I'm interested from as well is actually, how do you deliver the training? Because we are remote workers now a lot of the time, right? We work around the country, potentially around the world. I'm sure you've got some clients that are multinational in the same way we have. So how do you find, or how have you found, the most effective way to deliver training? You doing it remotely? You doing it on site? Do you do a mix? How do you kind of approach it?
I find it works best when it's blended. I think, like you say, we're in a completely remote world nowadays. Every practice, and it still shocks me how, I'm originally from a tiny practice in North Devon, but even in North Devon, I had clients all over the country, over Europe, Australia. And you think, how did you actually get this client list to start with? So we need to work, remotely now anyway, but depending on the system, depending on the implementation, we will give the client various different options. So we will give them an on-site option. We'll give them a remote option, and we will break that down. So we'll discuss the most effective delivery for them, whether that be, bringing multi-site teams together in a set location and us doing 1 or 2 days training there with them on site, or whether it is then a single on site with some remote sessions, or it's wholly remote. It's up for the client. But for me, generally, if it's something significant and there's inherent risk to it, and what I mean is something that disastrously could go wrong if we're doing something I don't feel easy, I would always recommend to do that on-site training, even if we have to take a little bit of a hit on margin and recovery. It's just to make sure that implementation goes well, because as soon as you lose the quality and reputation, you can also then lose the client as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, we tend to, most of the time where we are from the size of our, digital transformation business, we tend to not train on the high level operational systems such as inventory, project management. That's generally done by the software themselves. And we're then training on the integrations and then the finance element, the expense management. And that side, we've tended to get the price point right and do it remotely in a kind of a sharing method, and we can record it then and share that afterwards, so they can reflect, look at back. If they go, oh, I'm not entirely sure or can't remember how to do that, they've got a video they can review, which if you're on site, they can never do that, right? They have to remember it, and then they're kind of lost to it. So, but I completely agree with you. When it gets really technical, very precise, or something that needs to be carried out, as you say, over multiple days, on site is the best approach. And there are some brilliant systems out there that do that really well, and we kind of work alongside them. But on that then, Russell, I'd be really interested to kind of hear, well, what systems are you training on? Because I know most of the people that do digital transformation will be used to doing like Xero, QuickBooks Online, Dex, etc. But it sounds like you do some more advanced ones as well. So it'd be really good to hear what those are.
Yeah, so I mean, it does totally range. So largely anything within the ecosystem, we've probably touched a fairly high percentage of at some point. There's some really random things out there that clients pick up and use and then come to you already on. So you're having to like firefight that and understand the platform well, and then go out and put things right. So I'm still shocked at the number of things that are in this ecosystem that will connect into Xero, QuickBooks, Sage, etc. It's ironic that iPlicit are sponsoring today's talk, because again, moving into that, what I would call the proper mid-tier market, is absolutely where I think we all should be start going. I think for far too long, people are stretching the capabilities of your Xeros and Sage and QuickBooks, etc., with bolt-on ecosystems, and the jump between something like that and a NetSuite is quite significant in implementation, understanding, and functionality. So why use 20% of the functionality of NetSuite and stay in a space within Xero, say, where your reporting is ground to a halt. You can barely file a VAT return anymore, and it's just really clunky in terms of the experience. Where you can then move into these sort of solutions in the sort of mid tier. So that's kind of where our focus shift is moving to. But it's then just building out those core platforms for clients to deliver. So whether they're in certain niches, whether they're in certain industries, just building out effective tools and setups for them that you can then start to rinse and repeat is kind of where the focus is. But again, going back to the quality, you have to get that right at the start. So we put a lot of time up front in terms of doing that. But the other side, I think, of that is too many people focus on the platform training side. So whilst we all play around in ecosystem and different bolt-on apps and whatnot, I don't see many invest in the soft skill or the process change implementation and change management with their clients. It's very much, here's a system, these are the buttons that you press, that goes into that, and this is what it spits out. So ironically, during COVID, I had a fairly big-ish implementation that I was just a bit bored. I shouldn't have been doing it. And a client or a tax advisor consultant phoned up about a client they had. And this guy was pumping a significant amount of money into these two business ventures. I had no idea what they were. One was a massive warehouse unit. And within the warehouse unit, he was storing his friends and contacts' high-value vehicles. So any day, once this was built, his insurance premium could go from thousands to tens of thousands of pounds, depending on what vehicles were being stored there. This is like the high wealth individuals that fly over from Dubai, want their car for the week they're over here. They store it. They drive a Bugatti down to London. They don't drive it for the week they're over here. And then they drive it back and house it. And then he was starting up a Porsche racing team as well. So again, lots of moving parts, lots of complexity around process. The platforms were quite basic in terms of end-to-end, what we're bolting together. It didn't need anything significant, but from a risk perspective for the monetary investment that this high wealth individual is putting in, the status that it would give us in terms of doing a very good job for him, the doors that opened up afterwards. But what they wanted was a meticulous change management and process documentation, because they needed to continually scale that business going forward. What they didn't want to do was continually have to come back and rely on us to deliver that all the time. Now, we're absolutely there, and we supported them the whole way, but they wanted to be self-sufficient. Like, as much we do, we have internal processes, internal training. That's how they wanted to structure their business. So it's not just, for me, the platforms in terms of complexity. It is all of the other components that sit around it and make it a success at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to kind of unpick in that, Russell. There's a lot of information there. But I guess, one thing I'd definitely say is that change management is critical. We've done a whole kind of webinar specifically on change management because of how critical it is in digital transformation. Where you, I guess, take the change management yourself, you've trained your team and you can take and lead a client through it, compared to where you're training a client to do it, I would think becomes very challenging to get that balance right, because a lot of the skills involved in change management are very inherent. You have to be very open to change to be able to deliver that and manage that effectively. And so you might be trying to train a team that will never grasp effective change management. And so that's where I think getting that balance right and identifying it and being open to have those honest conversations up front are critical. But from, I guess, that digital transformation process, the training, you say that there's, every system you've touched. Where do you draw the line? Where do you get the balance right between going, okay, well, this is a new system, I'm never going to look at it again? Where do you go, oh, I can't invest to the point of training? Because that, there's always the investment, like from yourself to kind of skill up your team. Surely you must push back at some point and go, well, we can't train on this system because we don't know it enough. Where do you get that balance right?
Yeah, I think you have to, because if not, you end up, it's the tail wagging the dog all the time. So, we have clients that come in on all sorts of random platforms. And I think the caveat is that if they've self-selected a platform, we will do a review. We're not going to hold ourselves accountable as experts on the platform, and we won't necessarily deliver training. But what we can do is interact with the vendor to understand an integration setup and problems they may be having. And that's kind of where we'll draw the line there. And we'll be quite strict with that. If a client comes in with all sorts of spurious requests and say, we want X, Y, and Z because I've seen that this looks quite good, or my mate's using this, or whatever, and it's not within our skill set, exactly that. You first need to weigh up, how relevant is this to the rest of the client base? Is this a thing we'll be using going forward? Because if you touch something once a year, once every 2-3 years, you're never going to get the most out of it anyway. So I've always, and if you look at some of the previous stuff that I've done, I've always worked on a basis of a core platform, whether that be a couple of things that we know work really well and interact together. And then you kind of sort of build your deliverables there out. So I only go as far as what I call Core Plus, which is ancillary bolt-ons that sit in the ecosystem to solve different problems, but we know work really well with the core platform. So if it was Xero as the core platform, we'll have a list of platforms that we know that interact really well with Xero. If it was QuickBooks, we'd have the same, Sage the same, etc. In the outside of that, we try and limit it down by recommendations or sort of add-ons that we know integrate and work well in the outside world, but we don't hold ourselves out to be specialists in them. And we'll, like you said earlier, lean on the vendors to help deliver those with the client, and we'll have relationships with the vendors that will facilitate that. So it's more of a referrer type relationship rather than a we own the control. But in time, you find certain individuals have client bases that require those platforms, and they sort of upskill themselves out wider, which is great. And you sort of have a blended team. But yeah, you do have to be really careful these days because there are so many apps out there. You do have to draw a line somewhere.
No, I definitely understand now. And so you train in the areas that you are experts on. You might understand the system, so you can help regarding the integrations. You know, when you can get an app to actually communicate with you. We've had many times where it's just impossible to get response. But there will be one thing I'm going to end on, which I'm just going to pick up what you said earlier, which is that, you know, in this space, we should be moving into kind of that mid-tier finance. And I'm actually going to disagree with you on that. I think there are certain people that should be, you know, if you've got a devoted team and you've got the expertise, and maybe you're kind of at least 3 or 4 people in size, you can start moving into that mid-tier space. And the likes of iPlicit are a great example because of how they support you going into that. But there's always your limits. You have to understand your limits and not push yourself. And that's part of collaboration and networking. And so if you are like watching this and you want to be able to do stuff in the mid-tier and you don't have the scale, just reach out, become part of the Systems Advisory Network. You can collaborate with people in that and, and get more out of what you're doing. But I'm going to use this as a way to kind of wrap up this week's show. So everyone that's watching, hopefully this has provided you with valuable insights that you can take forward. Please do check out the show notes for links to Digital Disruptors, SB Digital, and every one that we've mentioned in this show, as well as our incredible sponsor, iPlicit. And I guess if you want to ensure you catch future shows, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch out for the release every Thursday morning. Thank you, and hopefully speak to you next week.